In his work Psychological Types, Carl Jung discusses his concepts introversion and extroversion. And I'll note that he is the one who actually coined those two terms and brought them into popularity within psychological research. He related the conflict between the introverted perspective and the extroverted perspective as being similar to that between the nominalist and the realist perspective. So the nominalist in philosophy is a person who believes that words, that represent universals. So, for instance, the concept man or the concept large, these things that are supposed to describe a large set, that they are in fact nothing but names. So, where the word man, to somebody like Plato, would designate the whole genus man, to a nominalist, the word man designates nothing. It's just a word. It is itself a particular. So, just to emphasize this distinction, on the one hand we have the genus, which subsumes the particulars, and on the other hand we have and that would be the realist perspective. So that's saying that the genus is real, it truly exists, this universal quality is actually a real thing, versus the nominalist, who thinks that it is only a real thing as a particular. So the genus as a genus isn't real. There is no such thing as a platonic form. There is no such thing as man. You can't point to the concept of man. You can't point to any category. You can only point to particulars. So they don't believe in these categories. They think that they're not real. Whereas Plato, being the ultimate realist, thinks that not only are they real, but they precede the world. They are real ante rem, before the world. Now, so this creates a distinction, creates a conflict between the two attitudes, where on the one hand we have the privileging of the universal. So that's the Platonic idea. His idea is that the universal, these concepts, precede the world. They exist in a super real world that existed before the true world. That conflicts with the attitude that reality is inherently tied to sensation. So the only thing that is really real are the things that we perceive by our senses. Now, both of those perspectives are obviously convincing. It's certainly hard to deny that what I see with my senses is a large part of what I determine to be real. But at the same time, I can't really navigate through the world without reference to universals. And if I see an objective similarity between two particulars, it is natural to assume or to believe that the universal that subsumes the two is itself also real, because it is supposed to reflect some true correlation between particulars. So the correlation of those particulars is also a fact. The particulars are facts, as is the relation between them. But the difficulty is that as I start to find relations between the relations of particulars and relations between the relations of the relations, and things become ascendingly more abstract, the reality of the abstraction becomes more and more questionable. So if I talk about man, it's very easy for me to picture, say, 10 men, 10 humans, and above them some category man, which is supposed to contain them all, because they are all examples of this generic category. But then if I were to take man and animals, and then and fire perhaps, and I were to say, subsume those underneath the category of life. Well, now the category life, it's less concrete than the category of man. So I start to think, is life a real thing, or is it just a word? And then if I were to have concepts such as life, death, time, and space, and I were to try and subsume those into a category of, say, attributes. Well, is the category attributes real? It becomes more and more difficult to envisage what that really means, what kind of particular could be represented by a very high abstraction. So Jung says on page 26 of Psychological Types, it is extremely difficult for us to strip the abstraction of its thingness, for there naturally clings to every abstraction the thing it is abstracted from. So what he's saying there is that in the category man, for instance, there sticks to it the actual perception of men from which that category was abstracted. So in the world, in the course of my experience, I come across multiple particulars, and then after I have encountered them, I notice a resemblance between them, and I decide to create a name for that resemblance, and I've decided to call it man, because they all seem to possess this similarity, and I will designate that similarity as being the quality of being a man. The difficulty is that that man isn't a particular. I can't point to man. However, man references things which are particulars. So he then relates this to the psychological state of a primitive human, where the thingness clings so strongly to the abstraction that it can't really be distinguished from a perception. So what he means is, when he thinks of the concept man, for instance, the primitive human, it's so tied to his experience of real men that he experiences the idea as something real. He thinks of the idea as itself a man, for instance. So he says here, it is not that the abstract idea is arbitrarily hypostatized and transplanted into a transcendental world of equally artificial origin. So what he means to say there is that it's not as though when primitive humans experience these visions or these perceptions outside of the realm that a normal Western person can experience. He experiences his thoughts as, he experiences hallucinations or visions, or he feels that there is a real presence of an otherworldly entity. The explanation of that is the fact that he's so rooted in his physical experience that even his thoughts are tinted with the color of physical experience. He interprets them as being a physical experience, which is very different to the idea which Jung is trying to object to here, which is that the primitive human comes to the idea, he creates his universal, and then at some point it is arbitrarily hypostatized, which means made concrete. So it's not as though the primitive has a thought, and then that thought, after already being abstractly thought, is then concretized into a real experience. That's not what happens. In fact, his thought is, as he is thinking it, it is so inherently and directly tied to physical experience that he perceives it as the same as a physical experience. So just to expand upon that a little, the reason he makes this point is because one of the main explanations for primitive human religion is that the religions are attempts to explain the natural world. So for instance, we look at Greek myth, and some mythologists are prone as an explanation. So for instance, if we look at Poseidon is some attempt to explain how the ocean works and how the rain comes and these sorts of things. And Mars is there as an explanatory force for war. And that these are supposed to be proto-scientific, that they're supposed to simply be descriptions, explanations, causal explanations. But they, of course, are limited by the limited rational capacity of the primitive human. Jung objects to this description of primitive religion with the following explanation. From this basic fact of the psychic realism and autonomy of the image vis-a-vis the autonomy of the sense perception springs the belief in spirits, and not from any need of explanation on the part of the primitive, which is merely imputed to him by Europeans. So it's not because he's attempting to explain natural reality in the same way that we try and explain natural reality with science. It's that his thoughts are intensely tied to sense perception. And then he, just as a concluding note, he says here, primitive superstition surprises us only because we have largely succeeded in desensualizing the psychic image. We have learnt to think abstractly. So part of the process of psychology could be considered to be drawing up projections off of the objects and trying to understand them objectively. For a primitive human, of course, there are more projections that are still presented upon the world. And so his thoughts, his mental life, he doesn't even have the concept of the objective world that emerges later. So his thoughts seem to him real. And that is the explanation of the gods. They are concrete. They are mental processes perceived by a primitive human being as concretely real. Because the primitive human being does not distinguish between the mental and the objective.